A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. You ever get that feeling where your brain is basically a laptop with the fan spinning at maximum speed, but you are not actually running any programs? You're just sitting there, wired, exhausted, and somehow completely stuck. Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly that, but on a much more serious biological level. He is asking us to look at the neurobiological bridge that leads from chronic stress, like the kind people have been dealing with during the prolonged conflict in Israel, straight into the territory of clinical depression.
It is a heavy topic, Corn, but an incredibly necessary one. We often treat stress and depression as two different files in the cabinet, but biologically, they are more like the beginning and end of the same runaway chemical reaction. By the way, before we dive into the deep end of the brain, fun fact, Google Gemini 3 Flash is writing our script today. It is helping us navigate the hardware of the human mind.
Well, hopefully Gemini has its cooling system figured out better than my brain does. Herman, you mentioned a runaway reaction. When we talk about chronic stress in this context, we aren't just talking about a bad week at the office or a tight deadline. We are talking about a specific biological state. How do we define that technically?
We have to distinguish between acute stress and chronic stress. Acute stress is the classic fight or flight. Your sympathetic nervous system kicks in, you get a burst of adrenaline and cortisol, you survive the threat, and then, critically, you return to baseline. Think of it like a sprint. Your heart rate spikes, your pupils dilate, and your liver dumps glucose into your bloodstream for immediate energy. Once the lion is gone, the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest side, takes over to clean up the mess.
But in a conflict zone, the lion never actually leaves the room, does it? It's just pacing in the hallway for 6 months.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. Chronic stress is what happens when that return to baseline never occurs. It is a state of prolonged physiological arousal, where the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis, stays on. In a conflict zone, or any high-stakes environment that lasts months, your brain effectively loses the ability to toggle the switch back to rest and digest. The HPA axis is essentially a relay race. The hypothalamus signals the pituitary, which signals the adrenal glands to pump out cortisol. In chronic stress, the runners never stop circling the track.
So the thermostat is essentially stuck at 90 degrees, and the furnace just keeps pumping heat until the wood runs out.
That analogy works better than you think. Only in this case, the heat is cortisol, and the wood is your neural architecture. When the HPA axis stays in overdrive, it starts a cascade that physically alters the brain. We are talking about macroscopic changes. Research from the Max Planck Institute back in 2022 showed that chronic stress can actually reduce hippocampal volume by 5 to 10% in as little as 6 months.
Wait, 5 to 10%? That is not just a rounding error. The hippocampus is the seat of memory and emotional regulation. If you are losing 10% of the hardware there, no wonder people feel like they can't think straight. Is that the causal link Daniel was asking about? Is depression just the result of the brain shrinking under pressure?
It is a massive part of it. The hippocampus is packed with glucocorticoid receptors. These are the docking stations for cortisol. When they are flooded constantly, it is toxic to the neurons. It leads to dendritic shrinkage. Basically, the branches of the brain cells wither away, and it shuts down neurogenesis, which is the birth of new neurons. When the hippocampus weakens, it loses its ability to inhibit the HPA axis. It is a feedback loop. The hippocampus normally tells the hypothalamus, hey, we have enough cortisol, shut it down. But if the hippocampus is damaged by cortisol, it can't send the off signal. So you get more cortisol, which causes more damage.
It is a biological death spiral. But I want to poke at this. Plenty of people go through high-stress situations and don't end up clinically depressed. They might be tired or cynical, but they don't hit that metabolic bankruptcy we have talked about. What is the tipping point? Why does the brain go from "I am stressed" to "I am shutting down"?
That is where we get into glucocorticoid receptor resistance. Think about how type 2 diabetes works. You have too much sugar, so your body pumps insulin. Eventually, the cells stop responding to insulin and the system breaks. The same thing happens with cortisol. When the brain is bathed in it for months, the receptors downregulate. They stop listening. Now, cortisol is actually an anti-inflammatory in short bursts. But when the receptors stop working, you lose that anti-inflammatory protection. This leads to systemic, low-grade inflammation throughout the brain.
So the brain basically becomes inflamed because it is trying to protect itself from the stress hormone.
The lack of functional cortisol signaling allows pro-inflammatory cytokines to run wild. This is where we see the transition to major depressive disorder. Inflammation in the brain affects the basal ganglia and the prefrontal cortex. It saps your dopamine. It interferes with glutamate. Suddenly, you aren't just stressed, you are experiencing anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure because your reward circuitry is literally being dampened by an immune response.
This is the part that I think people miss. We tell people to stay positive or be resilient, but you are describing a situation where the physical infrastructure for positivity is being dismantled by the immune system. If your dopamine receptors are being suppressed by cytokines, you can't will yourself into feeling better any more than you can will a broken leg to run a marathon.
You hit on a crucial point there, Korn. There was a 2023 study in Nature Neuroscience that looked at populations living under constant threat, specifically rocket fire. They found a flattened diurnal cortisol rhythm. Normally, your cortisol is high in the morning to wake you up and low at night so you can sleep. In these chronically stressed individuals, the curve was flat. They were exhausted in the morning and wired at night. That flattened rhythm is a massive biomarker for clinical depression. It means the biological clock is broken.
But how does that work in practice? If the rhythm is flat, why are they wired at night? Shouldn't they just be tired all the time?
It is more like a low-grade hum that never stops. Because the spike in the morning is missing, you never get that get up and go feeling. But because the levels don't drop off a cliff at 9 p.m. like they should, your brain never gets the signal that it is safe to enter deep, restorative REM sleep. You are stuck in a physiological twilight zone. You are too tired to live, but too threatened to sleep.
Okay, let's talk about the specific brain regions beyond the hippocampus. We mentioned the prefrontal cortex. That is the CEO of the brain, right? The part that does the planning, the logic, the "hey, let's not panic" talk. What happens to the CEO when the HPA axis is screaming for 6 months?
The CEO goes on indefinite leave. Chronic stress causes a loss of synaptic connectivity in the medial prefrontal cortex. At the same time, it actually causes the amygdala, the fear center, to grow. It gets more complex, more branched. So you have a brain that is physically better at feeling fear and worse at logical regulation. This is the survival mode paradox. Your brain is optimizing for immediate survival in a dangerous environment, but that optimization is the literal definition of a depressive and anxiogenic state. It is great for ducking into a bomb shelter. It is terrible for living a fulfilled life.
It is an evolutionary mismatch. Our brains are designed for a lion chase that lasts 10 minutes, not a geopolitical conflict that lasts 10 months. But I want to go deeper on this inflammation angle. You mentioned microglia. Those are the brain's resident immune cells, right?
They are. And they are fascinating. Under normal conditions, microglia are like the brain's gardeners. They trim dead synapses and keep things tidy. They are highly mobile, constantly scanning the environment for debris. But chronic stress primes them. It puts them on high alert. When they are primed, the slightest additional stressor makes them explode with inflammatory signals. They stop being gardeners and start being demolition crews. They begin stripping away healthy synapses in the prefrontal cortex.
Wait, so they actually start eating the healthy connections?
In a sense, yes. This is why some people seem to snap after a long period of holding it together. Their microglia shifted from a homeostatic state to a neurotoxic state. They begin over-pruning the very connections that allow you to regulate your mood. It is like the security guards in a building getting so paranoid about a break-in that they start tearing down the interior walls to make sure no one is hiding behind them. Eventually, the whole structure collapses.
So, it's like the brain's security guards start burning the furniture to keep the lights on. It's a total systemic failure. Now, Daniel mentioned the causal link. We have established the cortisol to inflammation to atrophy pipeline. But there is also the gut-brain axis. We have touched on this before in episode 147, but in the context of prolonged conflict, how does the gut play into this depressive slide?
It is a massive second-order effect. Chronic stress increases intestinal permeability, what people call leaky gut. When that happens, lipopolysaccharides, which are components of bacteria, leak into the bloodstream. The body sees those as an invasion and triggers a systemic inflammatory response. Those inflammatory signals travel straight up the vagus nerve or pass through the blood-brain barrier and tell the microglia to stay in demolition mode. So you can be doing all the therapy in the world, but if your gut is leaking due to stress, your brain is getting a constant danger signal from your digestive system.
It is a literal gut feeling, but it is a feeling of doom. Let's look at a hypothetical case to make this concrete. Let's call him David. David lives in a conflict zone. For the first 2 months, he is a hero. He is helping neighbors, he is alert, he is sleeping 4 hours a night and feeling fine. That is the adrenaline phase. But now we are at month 6. David is suddenly struggling to get out of bed. He doesn't care about the news anymore, but he also doesn't care about his hobbies. He is irritable. Is David weak, or is David experiencing the biological tipping point?
David is the textbook example of conservation withdrawal. His brain has realized that the high energy alert state is no longer sustainable. It has run out of metabolic credit. To prevent total system collapse, the brain forced a shutdown. That anhedonia and fatigue David feels, that is a biological strategy to keep him still, reduce his energy expenditure, and wait for the famine or the danger to pass. The problem is, in the modern world, the danger doesn't just pass in a few days. So David stays in this low power mode indefinitely, which we diagnose as depression.
And the longer he stays there, the more that hippocampal atrophy sets in, making it harder and harder to see a way out. It is a terrifying prospect, but it is also oddly validating. If you understand it as a hardware issue, you can stop blaming your character.
That validation is the first step toward intervention. If you treat it as a biological injury rather than a moral failing, you can actually look at the repair manual.
Let's move toward the actionable information Daniel asked for. If we know the HPA axis is a stuck thermostat, and the brain is inflamed, and the gut is leaking, how do we start the cortisol reset?
The first thing is reestablishing the diurnal rhythm. We mentioned that flattened cortisol curve. One of the most powerful ways to fix that is through high contrast light exposure. You need bright, natural sunlight in your eyes within 30 minutes of waking up. This triggers a healthy cortisol spike in the morning, which helps reset the timer for the rest of the day. It sounds too simple to be neuroscience, but it is a fundamental signal to the hypothalamus to start the clock.
What if it is cloudy, or you are in a situation where you can't get outside safely?
Then you use a high-intensity light box, 10,000 lux. You are trying to tell the brain, the day has started, the threat is manageable, we are in a rhythmic cycle. On the flip side, you have to be brutal about light at night. Blue light from screens tells the brain it is still daytime, which keeps cortisol elevated when it should be dropping to allow melatonin to rise. If you are in a conflict zone, you are probably checking your phone for alerts at 2 in the morning. That is a biological disaster.
Yeah, the doom scroll is a literal neurochemical poison in that context. You are getting a hit of fear-based adrenaline and blue light at the exact moment your brain is trying to repair itself. It is like trying to put out a fire by throwing a little bit of gasoline on it every 10 minutes. What about the physical body? You often talk about cold exposure. Does that help with the inflammation we were talking about?
It does, but you have to be careful. If you are already in metabolic bankruptcy, a 5-minute ice bath might be too much of a stressor. But short bursts of cold, like a 30-second cold finish to a shower, can stimulate the vagus nerve and increase the production of norepinephrine, which can actually help with that foggy feeling of depression. It is like a gentle reboot for the nervous system rather than a hard crash.
Does it actually lower the cytokines, or is it just a temporary distraction?
It is more than a distraction. Vagus nerve stimulation actually has a systemic anti-inflammatory effect. It signals the spleen to reduce the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So you are essentially using a physical sensation to send a peace treaty signal to your immune system.
And what about the leaky gut and the systemic inflammation? If the brain is on fire with cytokines, can we put it out with what we eat?
You can certainly stop throwing gasoline on it. In a high-stress environment, we crave ultra-processed carbs and sugar because the brain wants quick energy for the fight. But those foods exacerbate the gut permeability and the inflammation. The move here is high-dose omega-3 fatty acids, specifically EPA and DHA. We are talking 2 to 3 grams a day. These are literally the building blocks of the neuronal membranes and have a profound anti-inflammatory effect on the brain. There is a reason some studies show omega-3s are as effective as some low-dose antidepressants for certain types of inflammatory depression.
So, fish oil and sunlight. It sounds like the world's most boring vacation, but it is actually a tactical intervention for the HPA axis. What about the prefrontal cortex? How do we get the CEO back into the office?
This is where bottom-up and top-down interventions meet. Bottom-up is the light and the fish oil. Top-down is things like stress auditing. We often think we have no control over our stress in a conflict, but we do have control over the secondary stressors. Are you also fighting with your spouse? Are you also taking on extra projects at work? A stress audit means looking at your life and saying, my environmental stress quota is at 90%. I have to reduce my avoidable stress to 0. It is about radical prioritization. You have to give the prefrontal cortex a break from making non-essential decisions.
I like that. It is like load shedding on a power grid. If the main power plant is under attack, you turn off the streetlights and the neon signs, so the hospitals can keep running. You mentioned timed interventions in the plan. What did you mean by that?
Timing is everything in biology. For example, exercise. High-intensity exercise is a stressor. If you do it at 8 at night, you are spiking cortisol and telling your brain, we are under attack right before bed. If you do it in the morning, you are aligning that stressor with your natural cortisol spike, which actually helps train the HPA axis to be more responsive. Also, things like non-sleep deep rest or NSDR. These are 10 to 20 minute protocols. You can find them on YouTube that take the brain into a state of deep relaxation without actually sleeping. It is like a clear cache button for the nervous system.
I use those, actually. It is the only time my sloth brain actually feels like it is recharging rather than just idling. But Herman, let's talk about the hard truth here. Sometimes sunlight and fish oil aren't enough. When the hippocampus has already shrunk, when the microglia are in full-scale demolition mode, what is the role of medication?
It is vital to see medication as a scaffolding. Things like SSRIs or the newer glutamatergic treatments like ketamine aren't just happy pills. They are neuroplasticity agents. They increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor or BDNF. BDNF is like Miracle-Gro for the brain. It encourages the hippocampus to start regrowing those dendrites we lost. The medication creates a window of plasticity where the lifestyle changes. The light, the diet, the therapy can actually take hold. Without the scaffolding, the building might be too damaged to repair itself through willpower alone.
That is an important distinction. The medication isn't the cure, it is the tool that makes the cure possible. It lets the gardener back into the yard so they can start planting again. We also need to talk about the social buffer. We know that isolation is a massive stressor. How does social connection affect this HPA axis dysregulation?
Oxytocin is the biological antagonist to cortisol. When we have genuine, warm social interactions, we release oxytocin, which directly inhibits the amygdala and reduces the HPA axis response. In a conflict zone, people often isolate because they are overwhelmed. But that isolation is a biological trap. Even a 5-minute conversation where you feel seen can do more to lower your cortisol than an hour of meditation. We are social primates. Regulated nervous systems regulate other nervous systems.
So, if you are David, and you are feeling that conservation withdrawal kicking in, the hardest thing to do is call a friend, but it is also the most tactical thing you can do for your brain.
And David needs to know that his anhedonia isn't a sign he is a bad person. It is a sign his brain is trying to save his life in a very clumsy, prehistoric way. If he can start with the micro wins 5 minutes of sun, 1 phone call, a handful of walnuts for those omega-3s, he starts the process of signaling to his brain that the famine is ending, even if the war is still going on.
It is about creating a microenvironment of safety within a macroenvironment of danger. That seems to be the core of resilience. It is not about being tougher than the rockets. It is about being smarter than your own HPA axis.
I couldn't have said it better. The biology is real, but it is not a life sentence. The brain is remarkably plastic. Even the hippocampal volume loss I mentioned, that can be reversed. We have seen it in studies of people who recover from depression. Those dendrites grow back. The CEO comes back to work. The gardeners go back to trimming the hedges instead of burning them.
How long does that usually take, though? If someone starts these interventions today, are we talking weeks or years?
It depends on the severity, but neuroplasticity is faster than we used to think. You can see changes in gene expression within days. You can see changes in synaptic density within weeks. Significant structural regrowth in the hippocampus usually takes a few months of consistent safety signaling. It is not an overnight fix, but the brain is incredibly eager to heal if you give it the right inputs.
That is a hopeful note to start wrapping this up. Daniel, thank you for the prompt. It is a perspective that I think a lot of people need right now, especially when the mental health conversation can feel a bit too abstract. Seeing the wiring makes it feel manageable.
It really does. And big thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping our own HPA axis in check. Also, a huge thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and let us dive into these deep topics.
This has been my Weird Prompts. If you found this dive into the neurobiology of stress helpful, do us a favor and leave a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help other people find the show.
Take care of your brain, everyone. It is the only one you have got.
See you next time. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weird.